Hello there. This is a pre-recorded session of the speech that I will be giving at the Apidays, Helsinki and North on Monday, June 5th, 2023. And my topic is about lessons learned in API business and monetization from various industries. My name is Olli Kilpeläinen, and I've been working in the world of APIs in one way or another, I would say like 18 years in different industries, from mobile phones to IoT to robotics to virtual reality, cloud services and smart buildings, and now lately in access and security management. And I feel there's a lot of commonalities that we can learn when we look at different industries and how they approach API business. And I want to share some of those learnings that I have seen when building business around APIs. Specifically from my background, I want to focus on three different times in my career. I have been building an SDK and API product for media industry, where we are dealing with 360 virtual reality videos and how to distribute those and how to process the videos and eventually have them consumed by the end viewers. I also want to talk about learnings from an API ecosystem that was built for smart buildings around elevators and escalators. And in my current job, I'm working on API ecosystem that's around smart locking security systems for cities and buildings. And what's really common about all of these three examples throughout my career is that these are very established industries. They have many players that have been there for decades, and there are ways that they are expecting the business to work. And I've come to realize that there are quite a few similarities between them and things that we can learn. And I'm hoping some of the things I bring out will actually help you if you're trying to build an API business for an existing traditional industry. Now, why do such traditional industries with set players then want to change is, of course, because the world is changing so much. One way to look at it is look at the megatrends, for example. Here on the slide, I have put the Finnish Sitra's megatrend report, and especially how they see the future opportunities around megatrends. So I think many industries, whether it's media or building or facility management or now security, they're looking at the different things in the world that are affecting their business, whether it's related to the ecological reconstruction or how economy, how wealth is distributed or restorative nowadays, how people are considering their well-being and health, and how power and participation, trust is distributed in the world. And of course, all of them look at the digitalization. They look at what are the different things that are changing in the industry because of digital services, digital needs and use cases. So these are in a way the starting points of why companies then extend, of course, to digital services and eventually extend to thinking about APIs, partnerships, ecosystems. And all of that begins, of course, from value. What kind of value do they want to create for their customers in this changing environment of theirs? And when you think about values, you of course start thinking about the needs that you have, both the customer's needs and of course the needs of your colleagues, your stakeholders within those industries as well. I'm sure you're all familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, meaning that you need to start fulfilling more basic needs before you can move further in the chain, starting from physiological needs, going towards safety, belonging, self-esteem, and eventually self-actualization. And this is, of course, a great model for considering anything that is interacting with people and how do they approach their needs. But all of my examples are from industries and companies that work in B2B scape. So how do you create value for other companies from your own company's perspective? So I'm going to show another model that I like a lot by Almquist, which is a B2B hierarchy of needs. Similarly, it's starting from below, something you need to have fulfilled before you can consider the others. In the world of business, it's really table stakes. you need to fulfill certain things in order to be alive as a business before you can go further up in the hierarchy levels. But then you can move to what's called here functional values. How can your API business help the economic and performance of the company as a whole? And if you can find that justification and fulfill some of those values, you can go further in the hierarchy. And you can start thinking about, can my APIs actually help the customers with their own business, ease of doing business? Can I boost the productivity of my employees, for example, if my APIs open up new knowledge about how people are doing their work today? Can I create new strategic outcomes or make them faster, or bring operational benefits, or create new relationships with companies that were not possible before that helps you build the business, and so forth? And when you start seeing that your APIs and your API business is fulfilling this level of needs, then of course you can start looking at the higher, like individual values. Is my pitch about APIs helping a person's career or personal goals? And eventually, if we get that far, we can start thinking about the inspirational value. Perhaps the purpose, like in my companies, has been that the purpose of the company is to show that you are really ahead of the curve. You are going further and beyond what the competitor is doing. So you can also fulfill, in a way, a purpose for the company and their transition. I think interesting things to consider when trying to justify why are you now starting to talk about APIs in a traditional industry. And then in this kind of examples that I've been part of, APIs are really complementing an existing business. Companies that are working on the media, for example, they are building their media pipelines, they're building their content production pipelines, and that's what's relevant for them. And if APIs in SDKs are making something better, that's complementing it. Similarly, in the smart buildings and city space, the companies might be selling physical goods, whether they are elevators or locks. And that's their core business. And they will continue doing that core business. But what you want to do is you want to complement the offering with the digital services, with the APIs, and bring, for example, partners on board and start creating that new value through them. But then when you're not even trying to build a standalone API business, many of you are working on pure software companies where your main purpose is to create the business through the APIs. But in this world, you need to start justifying why you are putting money to build this kind of complementary business. So how do you start talking about the business case? And the business case is still tied to the core business and adding on top of that. And why are you putting money on this? So how do you justify the costs? And I believe this hierarchy of needs is actually one way to do that. So when you start thinking about how can I make the customer's life easier, I can read some of those ease of doing business values. That's when you can start getting the people around you and those customers as well to understand why APIs actually matter for them. And it's not just the physical product anymore, but the APIs do add value and do help in fundamental things in your business. Then another aspect, of course, when thinking about building a business that's complementing existing industry is pricing. And that's a topic we could talk a lot about. And again, you are all API experts listening here, so you're probably familiar with the regular pricing models we see, from starting, for example, free APIs, thinking about freemium APIs that after certain use have a price tag on them. We can have set subscription prices that are, for example, monthly or yearly based. And of course, we are all excited to see how the APIs are used and having pricing models that follow that, like usage-based pricing that's changing based on, for example, how many API calls you get. And then you can go beyond that to what's sometimes called outcome-based pricing or revenue sharing based on, for example, how much extra business you create with your partners. And it's in a way easy to assume, again, if you come from a very advanced software-only business, that it's immediately great to jump to the lower part of this picture. You jump to the more advanced models because usually they scale up better, right? But that might be complicated. And it might be that the companies are first looking at how can I first breach some of the barriers in my industry? How do I get adoption first before I even try to move to most revenue and go into that direction? So perhaps the first step is not and cannot even be in this said industry the one that scales fastest to create revenue, but you need to start somewhere. And this is similar in all of the industries I have worked, and I believe in many others, that you need to start taking with smaller steps and not assume we can immediately jump ahead. And I'll share some examples of why that might be. And that's because of different barriers in the pricing. So for example, in companies that are used to selling physical goods, that of course means that the companies are used to business models where there's a transaction-based pricing. You sell a piece of something, a piece of hardware with a one-time fee, and then the customer is happy for maybe 20 years. And you're also used to selling, therefore, or sending bills that are based on one-time payment. So if we now start talking about monthly bills, recurring revenue, your company might not even have possibility to do that. And that has been the case in all of these three industries and examples that I have worked on. That you need to start from the scratch and simply build the business model that enables you to talk about monthly value creation and monthly services to customers instead of transaction-based models. And maybe your billing system doesn't allow you to send bills every month. That can be also very difficult. And then if your sales is measured against, for example, this one-time payments, they're selling a very expensive piece of hardware, and on quarterly basis, you basically get a lot of revenue recognition from one sale. It might be hard to justify why are you now selling something that has a very low fee, but is a monthly recurring fee. Even if you can, in a way, calculate that over time, it is still not affecting your quarterly results as dramatically and as fast. And this can hinder your pricing models. And similarly, customers are viewing this, especially in these traditional industries. I have spoken to many customers and asked about what kind of prices do you see our APIs should have. And they may be very well aware of the advanced prices, and they can talk about usage-based prices and how that's great in a way. But then they say, let's stop here, because actually I need to know in advance how much to budget for this service. So I need to know exactly how many euros or dollars I'm going to spend in the next year or even 2 years. So they will not be able to accept a usage-based model. What they want is a fixed model. So maybe they're able to get monthly fees, but it has to be a fixed fee. And this is also affecting how you approach the market with your pricing models. So maybe this is just one example, but you need to approach the market in steps with your different pricing models. Maybe you start with a freemium model, you see who is starting to adopt, where the customers see value and you get traction. And then you can maybe start trying a moderate fixed monthly fee. And only later on, when the market is really there and it's starting to understand the value, they are ready to experiment with, for example, usage-based models or revenue sharing and any other models that scale with the business at hand and the usage. So very interesting thing to consider from both perspectives, in my opinion. And therefore, what I recommend is that we are usually talking about design thinking when we talk about products, and we are doing customer-focused and customer-centric design for our APIs. But we need to also think about design thinking for the business model and the pricing itself. So bring the options to the table. Of course, tell your stakeholders, tell your customers about the possibilities in the pricing models and business models, what all are out there, and start seeing what is resonating. So pull together the different options based on the feedback you get, and maybe do prototyping of a pricing model. Usually we talk about a prototype of a product, but we can also talk about a prototype of a pricing model. So we try with a few key customers from important segments. How does it work when we have a, let's say, fixed monthly fee, for example? How does that fit to their systems, their billing, their purchasing models, and see what happens? And then when we get the learnings, we can again converge those learnings together and hopefully have better understanding of what is acceptable for your market and these segments and what is not. So think about this whole situation in a wide manner. So we actually get the learnings, get to understand the customer detailed, and go step by step with those models. And of course, as I've been trying to highlight, there's always both sides of the coin in a way. You have to think about the customers, of course, those are your main source of revenue one day. But at the same time, you need to think about the stakeholders you have within your own corporation and within your existing stakeholders, perhaps within the industry that are not direct customers. So when you think about things like the needs that I started from, or you think about how to talk about business models that APIs bring and how do these things complement my existing business, and you start talking about those pricing models, there's a lot of people that need to understand the barriers, the restrictions, and the things that we need to overcome in order to actually go forward with your new API business. And therefore, while of course always keeping customer in the center, I highly recommend you start thinking about the other stakeholders around you. How do I approach the product managers, for example, that are now in charge of the existing products? How do I tell them about the needs in this API business? Make them your advocates for the change. And of course, your development teams, both yours and your partners, perhaps your customers' side, that they understand what's the benefit when you start bringing these kind of tools to the table and how they can start creating further value faster from business perspective as well. And then, of course, maybe in your business, like in many that I have worked, you have a big service and operations team who is dealing with how to onboard customers, for example, how to deploy solutions that the customers can use. This might not be purely software solutions. You might have exactly a combination of hardware and software. Maybe you have something running on the cloud, something on premise. Your APIs suddenly need to interact with these different environments out there. So how do you approach these people and tell them how their job is changing when you're now starting to bring APIs to the table? And of course, similarly, customer service and sales. Your sales need to be able to tell this story to their customers. Even if you, again, as an API expert and even an API business person, know exactly how to create value here and why this business model and this pricing model would be just perfect for your example. If your sales is not able to tell that story to their customers, and the customers are therefore not buying the story, again, those barriers will be multiplied that I mentioned. Those billing systems and reporting structures and whatever they have in place will become multiple times the harder barriers to breach than they would be if you have your sales force, your customer support also helping you tell that story. So a lot of stakeholders to bring on board, try to get them to understand the different needs, try to get them to understand the restrictions. So very simply, what I'm trying to say here is that when you approach a traditional business with APIs and API business models, API ecosystems, don't assume that everyone and all businesses are ready for the same level of API business that you're used to in pure software world. Try to understand what is the existing business. How have these companies been successful? Most likely, if they now have the possibility to extend beyond their core, they have been extremely successful in the past. So how can you actually tie your new values that you're bringing with the API business to that core business? And similarly, the customers are used to buying certain products from these companies. Why is the customer interested that you're now bringing something like an API on the table? How does that help them? Are you really able to make their processes simpler, or are we just assuming that they want something digital? So again, tying this somehow closer to the core from your own business perspective, and of course, from the perspective of the customer is the key. And then the industry itself can also have limitations. There are, of course, all kinds of standards. There are regulations in many industries. then there can be associations that are used to doing business in certain ways, and so forth and so forth. So try to also understand, in addition to individual companies, maybe there are some industry boundaries that need to be considered and breached or overcome in one way or another. So understand the business first where you are before you start telling exactly how the APIs make it better. I'm hoping this gave you some ideas what to consider when you're next time talking with your stakeholders in a traditional industry and try to pitch the story about API business and API ecosystems and partnerships and how they change the industry completely. And I would be very happy to talk with you about these things further after the conference or perhaps in another setting. Thank you very much for listening.